Good evening, my friends. Welcome to Chapter 20 of Mankiw's Principles of Micro. Today we're talking about earnings and discrimination. And I am again making a video at 9 p.m., so hopefully I can survive through it and not yawn at you too much. This is really interesting, and it's actually not very difficult. Mostly I am doing this to make sure that you can understand it, so that you can process it pretty well. I think it's really, really good stuff. Okay, so hold on one second. Got it. Okay, here we go. Today we're going to talk about wages, where they come from, a little bit about labor markets. I really think they should have done this right after factor markets, frankly, but that's okay. They do it the way that they do it. We're going to talk about discrimination, why economists tend to not think that there's a whole lot of discrimination, but some of the evidence that there is discrimination, how important that is, why education earns higher wages, and some things about that. And why wages can sometimes be above or below their equilibrium values. And we'll talk a little bit about, does the market solve the problem of discrimination? When does it and when does it not? And the answer is it does in some cases, and it doesn't help in others. Okay, so let's look at median weekly earnings. So this is in 2021. And so you've got everything from chief executives down to waiters and waitresses. Remember that median means the person that's in the middle of that spread. So chief executives do pretty well. Registered nurses are down there more close to the middle. Post-secondary teachers are a little bit lower. Education career counselors, and then finally down at the bottom is 576. So the overall median is about 998 per week. Okay, and there's a gender gap in all of these. And so there's a question here about, is this discriminatory? And how do economists think about that? This is actually a lot more complicated than most people will set out to say. A lot of people will say, well, it's obviously discrimination, because if men and women are being paid differently, then we know that it's just as a result of bias. And the economist is going to say, we need to look into that a little bit more carefully. So in competitive markets, as a reminder, we're going to look at the VMPL. So this is the wages that workers earn equal to the value of their marginal product. So you take the MPL, the marginal product of labor, and you multiply it by the price of that, and you can get the value of the marginal product. But there are a lot of factors that affect productivity and wages. So let's talk through some of these. So one of the things that I've said before is when I was in Baltimore and in DC, I got paid really well, and part of that was cost of living, but part of it was even higher than in the surrounding counties. And if I can be very blunt with you, it's because it was really hard to attract teachers, and so they paid a little bit more. I remember a friend once calling it battle pay. That was a little bit unfortunate to me because I loved working with kids in Baltimore, and I recognized there were challenges. But essentially what we're talking about in that kind of a case is when it's more dangerous to get somebody, or it's more unpleasant to get somebody, you have to pay them more. And so that's kind of what's going on here is when we talk about a compensating differential, we're talking about a difference in wages that arises to offset non-monetary characteristics of difficult jobs, right? It might be unpleasantness or difficulty or safety, even just a commute. So roofers are paid more than other workers with similar levels of education, compensating for the nasty smell of tar and the constant risk of accidents, right? Falling off the roof. Workers on night shifts, right? You can imagine that working on the night shift is just a little bit more expensive. And the way to think about this, if you ask me, is just think that it's a different supply and demand curve. That there are going to be fewer people who want to work in difficult jobs. Sorry, that's yawn number one. Let's see how many I get by the time that we're done. I'm gonna wager 5. Let's see how many I actually get to. All right. So when you have something like this, a compensating differential, that's what we're talking about. Extra money in order to compensate somebody for working in a hard job. So here are weekly earnings of full-time employed persons, age 25 and above, and you can see that there's like definitely an increase by education. And the question is, why is that? And there are 2 main theories that economists are going to use. The first one is called human capital theory. And the idea here is really simple. And the idea is because you go to college, you're smarter and you're better able to do things. And in fact, capital we think of as factories and stuff like that. Well, human capital means it makes people more productive. And so they are smarter. They're able to do some things. So let's look at this. This is an Ask the Expert slide. One of the leading reasons for rising U.S. income inequality over the past 3 decades is that technological change has affected workers with some skill sets differently than others. And you will not be surprised to find out, pause it if you need to think through that, that economists overwhelmingly agree that is exactly what is going on, that people with high education are still able to get really, really good jobs, and people with low education, those are the ones where technology is competing those things away. That's number two. All right. The increasing value of skills. So here's a great little case study if you have time for it. So as we increase international trade, domestic demand for skilled labor is going to go up, but domestic demand for unskilled labor will actually fall. And so one of the ways to look at trade is that trade is going to cause a lot of problems internationally. And the way that it's going to cause, it's going to cause a lot of problems domestically for unskilled labor, because it's just not going to make sense for people to hire. There's so much more competition that they can hire that out. Or there's a competitive advantage. There's not a competitive advantage, and we're going to import from other countries. We call this, this is related to skill-biased technological change, right? This is where we raise the demand for skilled workers who can use the new machines, but we reduce the demand for the unskilled workers whose jobs are replaced by industrial robots. And as it turns out, this is a real issue. And so it kind of gets into this question of, if we're just looking at the economy and we're saying, just add more labor, just increase the amount of trade and get rid of government intervention, it's going to be really favorable to people with a lot of education who are doing okay. So here's another example of the increasing value of skills. When students ask me, should I get more education? The answer is always overwhelmingly yes. So if you look at high schools over the last few years, last 40, 50 years, the education gap has actually gotten worse, right? So you will do worse today with just high school and no college. But look at what happens for college graduates. It's been high, but now it's even higher. Okay, and the percent extra for college grads has gone from about 40% extra to about 80% extra. The same is still true for women, although the differences are just a little tiny bit smaller. There's still the gap in here between men and women, but you can see that there's some really interesting stuff going on right there. Okay, let's talk about ability, effort, and chance. So what is really going on here? Let me just read through the slide really quick. So greater natural ability or effort. So there is a way to get paid more, and that's simply by having better ability or giving more effort. If an individual is working harder, then that could come through. They may beat the average for their class, for their gender, for whatever, for their race. So often command higher pay. These traits increase workers' marginal products, making them more valuable, so they get paid more. But wages are also affected by chance. So for example, there are sometimes just new discoveries no one could have predicted that make some occupations obsolete and increase demand on others. So you might get paid more because you're a really hard worker. And fundamentally, I guess, as I'm looking at the slide, the way that I would say this is, everybody who's being paid more claims that it's because they work so hard and have more effort. And they never seem to be willing to say, actually, I'm just really lucky. And I think the second is probably a little bit more fair. And is probably in some ways true. But we don't tend to say that quite as often. All right. Ability, effort, and chance are really difficult to measure. It's hard to quantify their effects on wages. They're probably important, though, and since easily measurable characteristics like education and age and such account for less than half of the variation in wages in our economy. And so the reality is here, it's probably the case that ability, effort, and chance are a much larger portion of why people are paid what they are paid than education, age, and seniority, and all of those other things. The things that are easy to measure don't account for nearly as much as you might think. So now I want to talk about, so we've already got this split between, is it your ability, your effort, and your chance, or is it these other characteristics? Let me mess it up even more for you, because a lot of people think that, economists in particular are going to look at this and say, well, but if you're better at your job, you should be paid more. And so if there are different groups being paid more, we're going to assume that people are rational and they're paying for some really good reason. Well, here's an argument to the other side. Hammermesh and Biddle find that people that are deemed more attractive tend to earn about 5% more than people of average looks. Average looking people earn 5 to 10% more than below average looking people, and the results are similar for both men and women. And so this is really challenging. Like, why are we hiring beautiful people when that has nothing to do with whether they're effective on the job? And the way that Hammermesh and Biddle kind of explain this is good looks are a type of innate ability. It determines productivity and wages, and it could be that an attractive worker is more valuable to the firm. Number two, reported beauty is an indirect measure of other abilities. If you're beautiful, you take care of yourself. Maybe they have more control. They're more diligent. Maybe they're more intelligent. They play a lot of games well. This is just one more game. And number three, so you've kind of got these three different possibilities. The third one is there's a beauty premium, that people are discriminating. And if you're average looking or worse, then you get paid less. And we're really paying to satisfy our own biases. Okay, and so all of these are valid, right? The data don't tell us which of these is true. We would have to do more research to figure that out. What we can tell you is that we pay people who are beautiful a little bit more than people who are not. By the way, I should let you know that this is not something that has affected me in my life. But I think there is a different one that may have helped me a little bit, and that is there's a tall premium. Tall people tend to do better in a number of different ways, and that's kind of interesting to me. That doesn't mean that I think it's a good thing that tall people get paid more, but it's just kind of one of those weird little social quirks about, like, why do we do that? Okay, go ahead and pause this as soon as I'm done reading it and see if you can figure it out. Active Learning 1, discussion question. Suppose you were offered this choice. A, spend 4 years studying at the world's best university, but you have to keep your attendance there a secret. Or B, get an official degree from the world's best university, but you don't actually get to study there. Here's a different way to say it. You can work at Harvard. You can go to Harvard and take classes and earn the whole degree, but you just don't get a degree. Or you can get the degree, but take 0 classes. Which one do you think will enhance your future earnings more? And so go ahead and wrestle with this for a minute, and then when you're done, unpause it. All right, here I go. This is a really interesting introduction. It's kind of a brainstorm to help you think about something called signaling theory. So we've already talked about human capital theory. That's the idea that you go to college, you get smarter, you become more productive. But there's another possibility, and that's called signaling. The alternative view of education is signaling theory. This is the idea that firms use education level to sort between high ability and low ability workers. So in other words, signal is not actually about you become better at your job. It's just a really complicated sorting mechanism, like a really, really expensive sorting mechanism. The difficulty of earning a college degree demonstrates to prospective employers that college graduates are highly capable, yet the education itself has very little impact on productivity or skills. The policy implication here is that increasing general education attainment would not affect wages. And so there's a problem here. If you think that, let me put it this way. I'm going to be mean for a second and pick on individual industries. I saw a paper a number of years ago that found that if you major in English at Harvard, you're going to be paid really well. But if you major in English at your community college, you're going to be paid nothing. Meanwhile, if you major in mechanical engineering at Harvard and at the local community college, you're still going to be paid pretty well, no matter which one you go to. Harvard might be a little bit more, but if you can do mechanical engineering, you're going to be fine in either place. That's a good example, again, of signaling theory, right? For Harvard English majors, the Harvard degree carries a lot of weight. But for other degrees, it's the mechanical engineering that carries a lot of weight. And so this is the idea of how much of education is signaling and how much of education is actually human capital. Okay, let's talk about the superstar phenomenon. There are superstars in every field, and this causes some really interesting dynamics. And so what happens is there's huge public appeal, and there's astronomical income. So you think about Johnny Depp, you think about Beyonce. Well, this doesn't actually happen in every field, though. It only happens in some. So let me describe the two parts of a market that are required for a superstar to arise. So part one, every customer in the market wants to enjoy the services supplied by the best producers. And two, the services are produced with a technology that makes it possible for the best producers to supply every customer at low cost. You can almost think of this as club goods, right? I can buy a movie with Johnny Depp in it, and it doesn't take away from other people being able to also purchase him. And so because of that, you're going to see a lot of superstars in industries where you can use their superstar stuff over and over again, and they get direct payments for that thing. You're not going to find it in other places. So for example, no matter how good your mechanic is, you're not going to have a superstar mechanic making a ton of money because every person has to pay them one time and they can only get access to one. If there was a mechanic who could clone himself and only the best mechanics were out there, that would be a little bit different. Let's walk through below equilibrium wages. So when might this happen? And there are a number of different possibilities. I'm confused why it says lower, because you would think that these would be above equilibrium wages. Yeah, for all of these, actually. Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe they're thinking above and below. So a monopsony, this is a market that has only, oh, no, 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 I see why. I see why. A monopsony is, it's just like a monopoly. The only difference is that a monopoly is one seller, many buyers. A monopsony is one buyer and many sellers. Okay, and this is typically the way that we think about this is in labor markets. So you can imagine the old coal mine in a small little town, and what's going to happen in that coal mine is they can pay people much less, and the people have to take the job because there's inelastic supply of labor. They really don't have a good substitute here. And so they're kind of hosed. And so this coal mine can treat them poorly and give them bad working conditions, or maybe just pay them very little, and they still have to sign up. And so that's a good example of a monopsony. Again, it's just like a monopoly in reverse. Instead of a monopoly kind of hosing you with really bad prices, the way you can think about a monopsony is they're also hosing you with bad prices. They're just giving you too low of a price for what you're selling instead of too high of a price for the thing that you're buying. This is another way of saying a labor market that's dominated by a single employer. So very often with the government can do this, where they have a big influence on the going wage. I feel like monopsony and the second bullet point are very similar. The growing problem, there's another problem, and there's a set of these problems. We call them transaction costs. Non-compete causes are a pretty big problem. And the way to think about this is it's almost like a tax on changing jobs. So if you tax changing jobs, then people change jobs a lot less, except here's the problem. Changing jobs is really efficient, right? Like it's actually good for people to find better jobs, to get promoted, to all of those things. A lot of economists have talked a lot about non-compete clauses, and they've basically said that they're a bad idea. So we'll come to that in a second. Basically, if you leave your company, you're not allowed to work for another company for a certain amount of time. Sometimes, and there's a legitimate case for this, it's to protect the employer's trade secrets. So if you're the chief designer of Coke, you're not allowed to go and work for somebody else because you might sell that product. Well, it also keeps people in their jobs, even when there's probably a better job out there that would be better for everybody involved. And so this can become a form of barrier to entry. It can be really, really nasty. So let's look at non-compete clauses. This is the quote: "The use of non-compete clauses in U.S. employment contracts reduces workers' mobility and wages by more than is justified by the protection of employers' intellectual property and trade secrets." In other words, is this actually about trade secrets, or is this just about keeping workers and treating them more poorly? Yeah, economists really believe that this is a problem, okay? And that's exactly what's going on. Let's look at cases where we see above equilibrium wages. So minimum wage laws, we've already talked about this. These raise the wage above where we would think they would be in equilibrium. The other big example is market power of labor unions. So this is basically the idea of we're going to band together and they can't hire me unless they also hire you. And they can't pay me unless they pay you and I exactly the same. Right? And so union workers actually do tend to earn a little bit more than non-union workers. That's number 4. I've got 25 slides left. I'm already at 4 yawns. This is not going well for me. All right. So that is one possibility. Now, there's a theory of efficiency wages, and the basic idea here is that above equilibrium wages paid by firms tend to increase worker productivity. And so this is kind of, if I'm understanding this right, this is like the $5 day by Henry Ford. If I pay people enough, then they will come to me and I will get more productivity out of them because I'm getting the best workers. And so there is also that possibility that we're finding the best people. Firms may pay higher wages to reduce turnover, increase worker effort, or attract higher quality job applicants. There's also the effects of above equilibrium wages. So let's talk about what happens when we have that. Well, the answer is we have a surplus of labor. We have a lot of unemployment. So when you see lots of labor unions, when you see lots of minimum wage, you would anticipate seeing higher unemployment. Let's look at active learning 2, which job is going to earn more. In each case, identify which worker would earn more and use the concepts in the chapter to explain why. The best doctor on the planet or one of the best actors on the planet. A trucker who hauls produce or a trucker who hauls hazardous waste. A college graduate or an equally intelligent and capable high school graduate. And someone who graduated with a 3.7 GPA or somebody else from the same university with a 2.4 GPA. Go ahead and pause this. Try and see if you can figure out who's going to be getting paid the most and what can we use from the chapter to identify that. Oh, there we go. There's number 5. Whew. Old man syndrome. It's 9:20 and I'm exhausted. 9:30, but still, same idea. Okay, here we go. the best doctor on the planet or one of the best actors on the planet, this is the superstar phenomenon. And the problem here is the best actor can service way more customers than the best doctor can. So because of that, the best doctor may get paid a little bit more. They may still have a premium, but the best actor is going to become a superstar. A trucker who hauls produce or a trucker who hauls hazardous waste, this is a compensating differential. By the way, I should say again, I am not saying that Baltimore was toxic or that it was terrible or that it was dangerous. I had a great experience. But there are a lot more people who are willing to work in Howard County, where I lived, than work in Baltimore City. And that's all that's being said here is in order to attract more people, you have to pay them for whatever reason. The same is true of long commutes and lots of other things. So yeah. Number C, a college graduate or an equally intelligent and capable high school graduate. You can already imagine which one this is, even when it doesn't make sense. So here's the key. I want you to imagine that this is at a restaurant and you're hiring for waitresses. Well, as it turns out, you're probably going to hire the college grad, even though that doesn't make sense. It's not like you learn how to be a waitress in college. And the reason is because of signaling theory. If they were able to graduate from college, that probably tells you something more about who they are as people. It probably tells you that they are willing to stick to things. It might even communicate something about their wealth or their family's wealth. And all of those things play into things that people might want. It's not actually about human capital. It's just about all of these other things that higher education can create. Someone with a 3.7 versus 2.4. Well, this is the human capital theory, right? This isn't about signaling. This is something about your classes actually prepares you more. Although I think I don't know. I think GPA can also be a signal. I think a better way to say it is somebody who had a lot of on-the-job training during college, internships and practicums and all of that stuff, versus somebody who doesn't, right? And I think that that's human capital. Okay. Let's talk about discrimination. This is a cool part. I mean, not that we like discrimination, but we need to explore this because it's a really heavy area of emphasis in the study of labor economics. And so if you ever took a labor econ class, you would see a lot of this kind of stuff in it. So the discrimination is offering of different opportunities to similar individuals who only differ by one other thing. So race, ethnicity, gender, religion, sexual orientation, age, or any other personal characteristic. This is another source of differences in wages. So let's look at the differences between men and women and black men and black women and white men and white women and all of that stuff. So median earnings in 2019, black men, 24% less than white men. Black women, 16% less than white women, but 10% less than the median black man. White women, 19% less than white men. Now, if you take this at face value, these look like very clear evidence of discrimination. And I am very open to the idea that there's discrimination. I think that there are in some cases. We have laws against them, and those laws are useful. They prosecute people when they try to discriminate, and I think that's probably a good thing. Having said that, I also think that there are probably some other explanations for why people might earn different amounts of wages. So let's dive into some examples here. Different groups of workers can earn substantially different wages, and that's not discrimination. Think about human capital differences. So the way that we would do this, for example, is in statistics, there's a way to do something called controlling. So we would say, let's control for how many years of experience they have and how much education they have. And when you do that, the differences between men and women, for example, tend to go down quite significantly. Now, not perfectly, but quite a lot. So if you just take into account education and years of experience, that tends to reduce the amount of differentiation between or variation between men and women. But now there's an additional factor here, and that is compensating differentials. And so the way that I would say this is men tend to do much more risky jobs, and they're very happy with that. So for example, many women choose education, and elementary education, an area that I know very well. The field is 90% women or something higher than that, right? And so because of that, the wages are significantly lower because teaching is not a high-income profession. But at the same time, what you'll see is that because women are somehow lower in human capital or their signal is worse? No, it's because of choices that people are making. They're choosing to go into those different fields. And by the way, I'm not saying that that's a good thing or that that's right or appropriate. I'm just trying to make sure that we're thinking at a deeper level about all of these things. And then we can kind of go on from there. Okay. Let's look at differences in educational attainment really quick. 36% of the white population had a college degree in 2019, men aged 25 and older, only 26% of the black population. Well, as it turns out, I don't think that fully explains it because we need to pay attention to this next piece. I think the quality of public schools is really significant. And as it turns out, I think black Americans in particular, have had really crummy schools compared to people like me, white people. And so as it turns out, I am very concerned that we see that as college differences, right? 36 versus 20%, 26%. But what's really going on is my Black American friends don't have the opportunity for college in the same way because they've had really, really low quality public school experiences. What about human capital itself? So if you look at job experience, this is one of the best ways to get human capital. You get good at your job just by being in your job. Women are way more likely to interrupt their careers to raise children. So if I remember right, a few people ran a study on gender discrimination, and they basically said, let's account for education and job experience and account for time for women to take off from work for pregnancy and raising the baby. And when you account for all of those, the gender gap shifts from like 77 cents on the dollar to like 95 cents on the dollar, some tiny, tiny number. Now it's still real. There's still a few cents there, but it's much, much smaller than most people think. And so, for example, when the political left says women are paid 77 cents on the dollar compared to a man, that is true. But they're not taking into account education and differential pay for compensating differentials or any of that stuff. And when you do that, there is still a gap, but it is a far, far smaller gap. And there's not a lot of clarity around where that is coming from. Women have less on-the-job experience than men because of pregnancy and childbirth. The population aged 25 to 44, 24% of women are out of labor force, whereas it's only 10% of men. And so you can very quickly get the idea that there's a lot going on here. Now, I should also note, there could also be discrimination going on that's embedded in these numbers. So for example, women might be choosing education because they love kids. They might also be choosing it because they had a really garbage curriculum that didn't prepare them for STEM careers. Or they were told, oh, you're a woman, you shouldn't be doing this. So I'm not trying to explain away discrimination with this. I think it could be very well real. But I want us to think at a deeper level about what that looks like and how that can be solved. Okay? So men and women do not choose the same type of work. Again, this is compensating differentials. Women are way more likely to be administrative assistants and men are way more likely to be truck drivers. And those differences come through in pay, and it's very, very clear. So let's look at another case study. This is an interesting one. Is Emily more employable than Lakeisha? So economist Marianne Bertrand and Sendhil Mullainathan answered more than 1,300 help wanted ads run in Boston and Chicago. I feel a little bit bad that they did this because a bunch of people were sorting through fake resumes. They sent 5,000 fake resumes to all of these companies, and they were identical in every way except that half of them had names that were more common in black populations. The other half had names that were more common among white populations. And what they found was that job applicants with white names received about 50% more calls. So this does seem to be discrimination purely on the basis of race because everything else about the study was the same. And I think that's a real problem, right? Like just looking at somebody's race based on their name, you're going to make very different calls about who you're going to hire. And that's a concern, right? Like that is not good. Now, again, there have been a few people who have, let's keep going because there's another group that did this. Aropoulos and, it's just Philip Aropoulos. Canadian labor markets looked at a similar thing, sent fake resumes with English, Indian, Pakistani, Chinese, and Greek names. Significant evidence of discrimination. English-sounding names received 39% more callbacks across the four ethnic groups, even if the fictional applicant had an English-sounding first name and a Chinese last name. There really does seem to be a preference for people who speak the native language, who are more like us, and I'm sad by that. I don't think that's a good thing. If you want to learn more about why we do this, you come take my psychology class. We talk about tribalism, in-groups, out-groups, trust for the in-group, all of those kinds of things. It doesn't make it okay, but it is a little easier to understand why and why it might not be full-out explicit racism, but it might still be the kind of thing that we need to work on and have conversations about. Okay, next one, discrimination by employers. If one group in society receives a lower wage than another group, we call that discrimination. So what happens if your employer is discriminating? And will the market fix it is really the question that we want to ask. So you control for human capital, you control for education, you control for experience, all of that stuff. Who is going to be to blame for this differential? Well, as it turns out, if the employer is discriminating, we should be able to actually model that using supply and demand. So let's imagine a competitive market economy. We would argue that the natural antidote to employer discrimination is this old thing called people are rational and they want to make as much money as they can. So let's look at some graphs here. You've got male workers and female workers. And now let's imagine that some firms discriminate against female workers, so they hire fewer females. Well, what do you think is going to happen? Well, as it turns out, there's going to be less demand for female workers. The price is going to go down. There's going to be more demand for male workers. The price will go up. And so you're going to have a wage differential. Okay, you're going to see something like this happen, except, wait a minute, if that happens, what is the smart person going to do? Smart person's going to go, this is great. I can hire women for a lower wage, giving them a cost advantage and economic profits, which attract entry of other non-discriminating firms. Let me put that in basic terminology for you. Because I am not going to discriminate, I can drive my discriminating friends out of business because they have now just increased their costs for no additional benefit, except that they are now feeling better about being sexist in the world. So that's great for me, right? I can drive them out because I now have a competitive advantage because I'm willing to take anybody who can do the job instead of just men who can do the job. Okay? So the discriminating firm is going to begin to lose money and eventually will be driven out of the market. So when the employer is discriminating in terms of who they hire, that's going to be fixed on its own because of the profit motive over the long haul. Okay? So the result here is the demand for female workers increases demand for male workers and falls until wages are equalized. Okay, so you're going to see it. Is that 6? I can't remember what we're at. That might be 6. Okay, let's see how many you guessed. Discrimination by customers, though, is a little bit different, and it might actually result in long-term discriminatory wage differentials. So suppose that restaurants care only about maximizing profits. They are not racist, but the customers prefer being served by workers with green eyes. Okay. Well, what are the restaurants going to do? They now have an incentive to only hire workers with green eyes, even if non-green-eyed workers are willing to work for lower wages, because they can, let's say that they'll get more customers by, $100 a night. And so because of that, even though they might have to pay $20 a worker more for their 3 workers in the restaurant, they're still making more by being discriminatory. And so this is an example where it's a little bit trickier. And this is, I mentioned this in class, discrimination by employers is fixed by the market, but discrimination by customers is not. So if you have really, really racist customers, just saying, well, the free market will fix this won't work in the long run. Okay. Let's talk really briefly about discrimination by governments. So some government policies mandate discriminatory practices. The U.S. had buses and streetcars that were segregated. The apartheid in South Africa before the 90s. These policies prevented the market from correcting discriminatory wage differentials. So you also can't say, oh, the market will fix it if you have laws on the books that force segregation of buses, streetcars, restaurants, things like that. Okay, wage differentials in competitive markets. Workers are paid a wage that equals the value of their marginal products. Many factors affect the value of marginal products and equilibrium wages. The profit motive can correct discrimination by employers, but not discrimination by customers or discriminatory policies of governments. Let's talk about statistical discrimination. This is when an irrelevant but observable personal characteristic is correlated with a relevant but unobservable attribute. So let's give 2 assumptions here, and then we'll do some examples. Assumption 1, employers have imperfect information about possible employees. Again, we have market failures when we have imperfect information, when we have information asymmetry. Employers may rely on the observable characteristic when making hiring decisions. So let me give you a specific, very, very classic example. Employers tend to care about punctuality. It means being on time to stuff. It is hard for employers to know whether a job applicant is likely to be punctual once hired, but employers know that 20% of workers with blue eyes are chronically late. Only 3% of workers with brown eyes are late. This is statistical discrimination. And the way that I want you to think about this that I think is really quite important is if you can imagine hiring somebody from a poorer area of town and you go, ooh, I don't know if I want to hire them. You are now engaging in statistical discrimination. Yes, they may be more reliable, but you have no evidence that they personally are, only that people from that area of town are. And so you are not discriminating on the basis of what you've learned about them from interviews and other things. You're discriminating against them based on what you know about their group, and that's not appropriate. You can get in big trouble with that, I think ethically as well as legally. And so you can't, that's not okay to do. Okay? Let's talk our think, pair, share here. To eliminate wage differentials due to discrimination, the government creates a panel to decide what jobs should pay so that people of similar skills and education earn the same amount. A, suppose an administrative assistant and a truck driver are judged to require the same level of education and skills, yet an administrative assistant earns $30K while a truck driver earns $40K. What would happen to the quantity supplied and demanded in the market for administrative assistants and truck drivers if the wages for these professions were set by law at 35 grand? By the way, I should just say this. This is creating a price. This is government setting prices. This is price caps, price floors. It's going to cause all the havoc that you're used to. You're going to have too much of one, not enough of the other, and that's why we want to stay away from that. But if you want to eliminate the wage differentials due to discrimination, there aren't a lot of good options, and so you can probably already see some of that. What you would have in this case is there would be a surplus of administrative assistants and a shortage of truck drivers. And so you can't really so easily just set the wage. You need to think through it for yourself and say, is there a way that we can reduce the discrimination? Because just setting the price in the way that we want to causes probably very, very big problems. 7. We're at 7. B, what would happen to the level of effort and natural ability of the workers available in each market in question A? What would happen to the quality of work generated in each market? C, suppose it is true that the skills and education required to do each job in question A are in fact nearly identical. What explanation would an economist likely propose to explain why the equilibrium wage differs by 10K across these markets? Let's answer B. Hardworking, high-ability workers would avoid the truck driving market and the quality of truck driving would be reduced. Hardworking, high-ability workers would be attracted to the administrative assistant market, and the quality of administrative assistant services would be increased. The way to think about this is because one job is more safe than the other, you're going to have a lot of people flocking to that. There's going to be more competition for that, and they may find even better workers for that one, but truck driving will become even worse off. Let's look at C. An economist would argue that $10,000 is probably the compensating differential necessary to get someone to undertake the disagreeable nature of truck driving. Working alone, overnight travel, less clean, less safe work environment, being on the road all the time. That's what we're talking about there. Okay, chapter in a nutshell. Workers earn different wages for many reasons, compensating workers for job attributes. Workers with more human capital, both in terms of education and experience, are paid more than workers with less. The unexplained variation in earnings is largely attributable to ability, effort, and chance, and we get about 50% of both of those things, right? So next, more educated workers earn higher wages, not always because education makes productivity. That's human capital theory, but sometimes it's just signaling, right? And that means it's not because you are better worker. It's just because college has become a really fancy sorting device that's really, really expensive. What causes below equilibrium wages? Monopsony. What causes above equilibrium wages? Minimum wage laws, unions, and efficiency wages. Okay. Some differences in earnings are attributable to discrimination. That is real. Measuring the amount of discrimination is really tough because you have to correct for differences in human capital and job characteristics. When we do, it's much smaller, but there are still differences, both between men and women and black and white. Discrimination can also occur for statistical reasons. Again, if you have imperfect information about employees, they may discriminate against all members of a group whose average characteristics the employer finds undesirable. So it is in fact rational. That doesn't mean that it's ethical to say, oh, you're from the bad area of town. People over there are lower income. You may not be as reliable. That is pretty gross ethically. But at the same time, you're going to be right statistically more often than zero. And the answer to that is you need to have employment processes that actually evaluate whether somebody is good on their own basis and not because of their affiliation or their membership in a group. Last but not least, competitive markets tend to limit discriminatory wage differences. If one group of workers earns less than another for reasons unrelated to productivity, then non-discriminatory firms will be more profitable than discriminatory ones. This is what Milton Friedman always said. If somebody wants to pay men more than they pay women, we should let them, because now they have to pay for their desire to discriminate. And over the long run, they'll be driven out of business. And the other people in the market who are just there for a profit will hire those women, raise the prices, raise the wages, and over time drive out the bad discriminatory people. Okay, that's it for today. I hope that was helpful for you. Earnings and discrimination is really interesting stuff. I love labor econ. I just think it's a really, really cool one. I'm even thinking we might be able to turn it into a whole unit for my next semester just because there's so much good, juicy stuff in it. Okay, God bless you, my friends. Be well. We'll talk to you all later.